Alan, thanks for being here.
Ben, thanks for having me, buddy.
Yeah, no, this has been a long time in the making. We've obviously had a lot of conversations, kind of in private, talking about all things long toss, pull downs. Obviously, something you've been passionate about now for the last 20, if not 30 years. But specifically, I know you wanted to get on this podcast and talk about, at least to start, talk about how to crow hop properly. So first things first is why are you so passionate about this topic? Why now? What kind of drove you to reach out to me and want to talk about this topic in particular?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ben, thanks a million for doing this. I'm inspired. I feel like at the end of the day, what are we all trying to do? Number one, we're trying to keep kids healthy. That's the bottom line. You have, if you're not healthy, you can't play. So that's anybody that's training or as a coach. We're all doing the same thing. We're number one. We're superseding health, and so I go back to the beginning. When I played and threw, and I think I did a lot of things more instinctively. And as I've mentioned to you and other people, I grew up doing a lot of body surfing, and so crow hopping to me was something that I don't know if anybody really ever told me how to do. I really don't. I wish I could give somebody credit. I'm sure somebody might have, but in fact, you know what? I think it might have been my current business partner, Jim Batcher. I think maybe early on, it might have been something I got from him. We were actually long toss partners at Cal State Northridge back in 1986, which seems like a little while ago, considering I'm only 31. But it might have been from him. It might have been something he did. And so this goes back, 86 goes back, 36 years. And again, maybe it was something I just related to right away because I grew up body surfing a lot. And I always felt this gather of the wave and this release of energy. So when I crow hop it off the back leg, it felt so good because first of all, I'm simulating who I am off the mound, but more importantly is I felt like when I threw the ball, I felt like I had the support of my body. I felt like I was really well balanced. I felt like my arm was sort of coming along for the ride. And it just felt intuitively, instinctively so natural. I felt like I was able to throw the ball far. And then the other thing, which we'll get into later with things like pulling down, is the other thing is loading off the backside. All of a sudden, I felt like, wow, I was able to get out in front much easier because I was able to load like the wave and then release out in front. And then to kind of answer your question, what got me going on this more recently is we used to do a pro camp before spring training for 8 weeks, getting guys ready. And everybody that we've trained basically has done it this way for 30 plus years. And sometimes some of the returning guys in our pro camp would come back and they would do the shuffle thing. And I didn't really understand it because it didn't look anything like what we were doing. And then I would learn from them that that's what was being taught to them. And it makes sense because back in the 90s, I think things were a lot more mechanical and anatomically correct and stay on line and front side in. And I think with maybe the rehab protocols, things were a lot more linear. And so I think the shuffle step got popularized. Anyway, they come back from a year, into our camp the next year, and we had to kind of say, look, I see what you're doing, but we want you to do it this way. And because when I saw them shuffle, the one image to this day I still have, which is why maybe I've got passionate about it again, because I've been out at UCLA a lot. I've been watching guys get throwing and getting ready for spring training and changing a lot of guys from shuffling to crow hopping and on the backside, and they love it. And long story short is whenever I see the visual of someone shuffling, the first thing I see is an arm sort of dragging behind and the body's out in front. And I can viscerally feel it in my body, like the wave is gone, but the arm is still hanging, the power and the support is gone. And I just feel like the pressure is going to go either to the elbow or the shoulder because the arm's just left behind without, a lot of support. So long story short is I've been feeling this along with my partner and in China, the people those of us that have been teaching this for a long time. And I just feel like when a baseball player goes to the field or a softball player goes to the field, the majority of their throws are on flat ground. And I thought this is a huge topic, and I have always felt that way, but I think more recently it's just been knocking on the door harder and harder to start really talking about this and getting this out there in the world. So hopefully
Sure.
that was a that was a
Yeah,
way of coming back to your question.
for sure. So do you mind if I can play a video of one of your former students doing the leg lift curl hop for people who, because again, like not very many people around the game of baseball do this at the college professional level. It's still kind of a niche way of curl hopping.
Please, yeah.
So I think it'll be helpful for people to see specifically what you're talking about. So obviously basically hopping through their delivery, but off the back leg, hopping through their leg lift.
Yep, yep. And this is Alex Merrick's. It's funny, I reconnected with Alex about 2 weeks ago, and this might have been from the early 2000s. So this might have been about 20 years ago. And he was a 5'10", fourth round pick, at a high school, and had a great arm. And yeah, so it's just it's a real simple example of just him really loading off the backside. And I'm sure at some point we'll go through other examples that we have, but this is a good one because this he just looks, he's loaded, he's explosive, and you can just feel him getting downhill. You can feel the wave releasing the energy out in front. So yes, love this.
For sure. And yeah, I didn't actually realize he was more of an undersized guy. You know, the way he throws, I just assumed he was 6'2", 6'3", but that's even more impressive how hard he's throwing at that size. But you know, one of the things we've talked about in regards to I'm calling it a leg lift curl hop because everyone's now calling different types of curl hops. One thing I've kind of noticed is your concern that you mentioned is kind of a sequencing and an arm health and an injury prevention standpoint concern. That's one of your kind of first and foremost concerns. I think we both share the concern, which is, you know, how do we best transfer what we're doing in long toss to our delivery to the mound? And so that's where, from our end, we started realizing like, hey, there might be a better way to do this. Is, well, first off, when we have athletes doing these, you know, 100-foot running pull downs where they sprint across the gym, sprint across the field, and basically fall on their face and don't block any of the energy, just to hit a 2 miles an hour harder on the gun. We really didn't see very good transfer of that to the mound in terms of the velocity. They'd be pulling down 102, and then they'd get on the mound and be 90. And it didn't make any sense to us why we would train that. So kind of our first step was like, and I wish years ago I'd kind of realized the leg lift curl hop was a good way to do it as well. But just shortening the curl hop to like a 1 or 2 step shuffle. And so that does transfer better than sprinting across, you know, sprinting 100 feet. But then we started asking like, hey, is there a better way? I started to kind of discover and dig up some of your old videos. And we started coming up with some different kind of variations of that. And so I kind of want to get your take on these. I know I've given you a heads up on a couple of these different variations, but so obviously the Alex Merrick's example, he's curl hopping forward. He's got that like 1 foot of kind of forward momentum in that hop. We started playing with a couple of variations of that as well. One is kind of a curl hop in place. So I'm curious, you know, taking that to the mound, what you think of it. Trying to basically take that forward curl hop. How do we blend that? We were thinking about, can we blend that by basically making it a little bit more specific? Once they feel that, can they feel that in more of a stationary curl hop? And so this is one of our big leaguers just playing with that. And then I'd also like to get your take about this variation. This is another one of our MLB guys, Mitch Keller, doing kind of a similar variation. So he's doing a step back here, but basically like rising up onto the toe. And so he was still doing the leg lift curl hops, but then this was like a feel for blending that. So I'm kind of curious, have you played with other variations of it? Do you kind of allow the guy to have his own stylistic difference in terms of how they do that? Or do you kind of teach the exact same way of going through that curl hop for everybody?
We teach the exact same way. However, as you know, with long toss, the word we talk about a lot is variability. And I love the word blending that you just mentioned. So I would say that if, you know, we really stopped being on the field with guys in camps maybe 7 years ago, the way things have evolved, just life in general, I would say for sure, as I would start to see things, and I have seen plenty of this out there in the world on Twitter or wherever, and I love it. I love the blending. I love the variation. I still think for functional reasons, when you're long tossing on flat ground, I'd like guys to be, and look, we want guys to get momentum and be athletic. That's a huge part of our program. So we don't want them real staticky, so to speak. Now, from what I understand, the more static you are, the better the ground forces are. So there is a benefit to being more static. And I think you're going to show maybe later a video of Jack Flaherty where he's very static. However, we also want momentum. We want athleticism. So to me, and that's why even with our guys, when they get to 300 plus feet, they're not over their backside. They're taking a step, they're gaining ground. And for that reason, I love this stuff. I love the idea that you have somebody on a mound doing it to incorporate more of that functional training on flat ground, and you're actually bringing it to the mound. I love some ideas of going backward and forward. I think really to answer the question, Ben, at the end of the day, as long as we're getting loaded off the backside, so we're optimizing ground forces, we're getting into the glute, the quad, the calf, we're getting that foot into the ground properly. We're getting it into a position where I keep saying this, the arm is along for the ride and we have better downhill plane because of it. Absolutely is the short answer. I love this blending. And we would do that if we were out there with athletes currently training them the way you are. We would definitely play with some variations. But again, if a guy's at 330 feet, we just want optimal support of their arm. We want optimal engagement from their body to support the arm. And to me, that's going to be something a little more simplified. But again, love the idea of blending.
So now you mentioned having those athletes kind of be driven from the backside, feel the back glute, feel that backside active throughout the throw. Do you find that it takes a lot of coaching through these patterns, or do you find that they kind of self-organize into a good hinge and a good posture on the back leg just through the act of doing that type of curl hop? Like, do you have to cue them to stay in the glute more than the quad, or does it kind of take care of itself when you show them this variation?
Thank you for asking that question. It'll be one of my favorite questions you asked today, unless you ask me a question about meditation. And the reason why is this: you would think that there might be some trial and error. Out at UCLA, I've probably come across 9 guys, probably half of them are in the big leagues. And I say that not in an ego way, I say that because they're very advanced and they have, let's just say, a lot of history. And within one throw with pretty much every guy, because they've been pitching for many, many, many years. So they functionally, again, they know what it's like to lift the leg, how the body obviously moves, organizes itself. It's in their core, right? So as soon as I give them this crow hop, it's like they saw a ghost. You know, I'm being a little dramatic, but the point is this: the first thing they notice right away, I'll get to the body in a second, they notice the ball is carrying much easier without as much effort. And 2, they do feel the parts of their body that they would want to feel that are working on the mound. Max Fried, I hate to drop names, but Max is one of the guys who was doing this more, I believe, in high school, and then I hadn't seen him in a while. And so he was doing more of a shuffle the other day. And then and I didn't want to say much to Max because Max is doing just fine, as you know, the way he's doing things. But then in his pen, he had mentioned one of the things he's working on is being loaded better. He even mentioned a great tip he got last spring training. And then I thought, well, there's a window to at least broach the topic. And we talked about it. And I said, you know, do you realize that when you're long tossing and if you're shuffling a little bit, you know, you're training your body to do that. And here you are wanting to get more on that backside, more on the ground forces. You want to reproduce and acclimate your body to what you're going to do on the mound anyway. And we talked about it, and he got it right away. And so sure enough, the very next day that I saw him, he was out there. And it's fun because Max is such a great athlete. He was actually looking almost like an outfielder with his crow hopping. But now he was able to do a form of training where he can relate to his body replicating what he wants to do on the mound. And in this case for him, it was helping him practice better loading, right? Getting into that back glute, getting more into his ground forces. and then letting that, as the word you and I have used a lot, transferring that or translating that to the mound. And so that would be a great example of someone who within one session, but I guess the question I should have gone back to is it really is more about in that first throw. Yes, that it's amazing how intuitive these athletes are. And when you show them to do something that is relating to what is efficient and effective for them, and also familiar, and they're
Right.
activating it, but now they're activating it, they get the benefit of activating this not just in their bullpen, but now they're activating it on all their throws on flat ground. It's just very powerful. So yes, they get it very quickly.
So it's interesting because I posted a clip of Alex Merrick's doing the curl hops on Twitter and said, hey, podcast coming up with Alan, submit any questions you've got ahead of this podcast. And somebody DM'd me referencing the tweet and said, this looks very complex, very hard to time up, very hard to sequence. And I said, actually, the opposite. My experience is guys know how to lift their leg. You add the hop and it just like flows. You add just a hop through the top of their delivery, which they already know how to do. They've already practiced that. All we're adding is a 5% more dynamic component to the delivery they've already been doing. And at least in my experience, watching guys, like they get it very quickly. It's just giving that different starting trigger to their delivery. Instead of their starting trigger being like a static leg lift, it's just a more dynamic hop. But the rest of the throw just unfolds on its own. So I told him it might look like it's more moving parts, but it's less conscious thinking in the brain. It's just you get the train moving with the hop, and it's just so dynamic from there. At least that's been my experience doing it myself.
It's instantaneous, Ben. I think actually the part that takes a few seconds or a few throws to get, which is ironic, is just how they step into it.
Right.
Kind of a left, right. Obviously you can start them out by being very static and on the backside and just go off the backside. That's very simple. But as you know, we like guys moving. We want we want athleticism, and so we do talk about kind of a left, right, and up, or for a lefty, like a right, left, and up. And sometimes that takes a few throws for them to sort of get with that because that's new to them. But as you said, the part of really loading off the backside, they've been doing it their whole life if they're a pitcher. So that part, as you said, connects really quickly.
So to kind of summarize, if you would agree this is an accurate summary of kind of the difference between shuffles and between curl hopping off the back leg, you refer to it as functional training. Is it fair to say what you're talking about is in a shuffle step, you're kind of giving yourself this free kind of linear momentum where the back leg is essentially coasting. Your back leg isn't actively supplying that throw with power. It's the step into, the run into that's giving you that kind of free momentum. Whereas with the leg lift type of curl hop, you're actually loading into the back leg. You're loading the calf, the glute, the quad, the entire chain of the backside. So you're still supplying power. You might throw 95 on a shuffle. You might throw 95 from a leg lift curl hop, but one of those, you're actually loading the entire backside, whereas the other, you're using this free momentum and just kind of coasting through the backside. So both of them, maybe you're still using your arm, your lead leg, like similarly, but you're only using the back leg like you would off the mound when you curl hop in that way. Is that kind of how you think of functional training when you use that term?
Yeah, but I would add this, Ben. When you shuffle your lead leg, not only is your back leg, of course, gone and you're not loaded on the backside and planted per se, but your front leg to me also is not replicating what you do as a pitcher. You're teaching your legs to go forward quickly. I guess I don't even know how you would lift your leg and not shuffle. I mean, I think I think by shuffling, your front leg is also doing something different, right? But regardless, the hips, the lower half, to me, are going in a position that unless you're practicing slide stepping on the mound, I mean, unless you're doing this because you want to be a good slide stepper, then that's the functional movements you're teaching your body to do. Is you're teaching your body your lower half to rush, your backside to drag, right? And so it's a lot of it is the back leg per se and the glute and the quad and all that stuff. But a lot of it also is just what are you doing as a pitcher? I mean, if you just visualize yourself as a pitcher and you lift your leg up and load, it's yes, what is your backside doing when you lift your leg up? But what is your front side doing? Even what's your leg doing? And what's your torso doing? What's your head doing? And so I guess to me, that's what we're replicating. Do I have an issue if someone wants to do some shuffling and for diversifying and blending? There's some things from shuffling, maybe some athleticism. You can pick somebody up. You can make them speed maybe someone's a little slower. You want to speed them up. I get it, but I don't want to speed them up at the cost that they're going to do a lot of throws with their arm dragging and not getting support and putting themselves in a position to injure their arm because their arm now is kind of left alone to do the work or let's say has a minimal amount of support from the body. So I hope that I want people to understand it's not just about the backside as critical as that is. It's just sort of functional movements, meaning you're moving in the same way that you are on the mound, and you want your body to replicate that, I guess is the easiest way to say it.
So when you do have an athlete curl hop this way, what would you say are the main flaws that you see? So they're going through the leg lift curl hop. Do you see athletes kind of struggle with getting downhill? Do you see them taking too big, too aggressive of a forward curl hop, even with the leg lift? When you teach it, essentially, I understand you're teaching it with this style in mind, but what are the common issues? An athlete's watching this, he wants to go out and try it. What are the common issues, stumbling blocks to watch out for?
Number one is health. I feel like, again, I know I keep coming back to this topic, but you can either have optimal support of your arms so that your body's doing the load and not your arm, or you can throw in a way where your arm is doing the load and not your body. And so for me, when I see someone shuffling or sliding or gliding or whatever you want to call it, I see this, it's like this red light, flashing red lights and a bullhorn yelling at me like arm dragging, arm not getting support, arm vulnerable. So that's just like the health piece is number one. The second piece is the art form of what it looks like to watch a pitcher pitch. There's an artistic load and gather. I know you're at some point you're going to put up a really cool video that really shows sort of the wave. You're just seeing this beautiful wave gather and this energy release out in front. So the artistic part of watching someone that's shuffling or gliding through the throw, I now see this arm I see the wave busted, right? I see the wave, yes, thank you. I see the wave is gone. And so again, health is one, but two is getting to the downhill plane because you're using the wave to your advantage to release the energy out in front. And so once I see the arm dragging, I see health issues, number one. Number two is I see that inability to get downhill nearly as well as you could. So I'll let you talk about the wave in this video.
Awesome. So I know you've used the body surfing analogy. This is something that we talked about right before the call. Is, I've kind of on my own used the wave as an analogy, but in a slightly different way. The way I kind of refer to it to guys is stitching waves of energy through your body or creating loops of energy through your body. The way that I kind of describe it to guys is essentially the energy is going to start from the ground up, start from the back leg. That you can be visualized its own wave. It's got its own energy. Eventually that needs to be able to transmit into rotational energy through the pelvis. So the pelvis has its own energy that it can supply, but it needs to also accept the energy from the back leg and ideally add it to the own energy that the pelvis is supplying. And then same thing, that works its way up the chain. Now the torso has the ability to either to produce its own energy, but also accept that energy from the pelvis. And then now you have the arm. The arm can supply its own energy on its own, but ideally it's also accepting that energy as it winds its way up the chain from the torso. So it's this additive, these waves being added together, working its way through the chain. This other post from one of my buddies, Kevin Foster, Javelin Anatomy, kind of talked about this in a kind of more physics framework, which I think is super interesting. But he was talking about it in terms of connective tissue, stretching and contracting, and waves. So he said, muscles, tendons, and fascia are all intrinsically elastic. The stretching and contracting of these elastic tissues can be looked at as waves of tension. So again, a different way of using the wave analogy. Remember in physics class how all waves followed a sine function when analyzed on a graph, right? That's this right here. The same concept can be applied to stretching and contracting muscles, tendons, fascia. Building on this concept, when two waves collide, they can either be constructive or destructive. That is, they can either add together or cancel each other out. Whether they add together or cancel out is a function of timing.
Mm.
So I love the fact that he connected that to physics. And you can think about it. We talk about the way from the back leg, the way from the pelvis, the way from the trunk, the way from the arm. And these are all working independently of one another. But as they pass together, they can either create a bigger wave and it creates this progressively larger wave flowing through the body. Or if you have a hitch with the back leg as it transitions into the pelvis, pelvic rotation, or if there's a hitch between pelvic rotation and the trunk, or if the arm doesn't quite time up, the arm swing doesn't time up with what the torso is doing, those waves can actually be destructive. So it just kind of validates everything that we intuitively kind of feel and observe with our athletes, but kind of approaching it now between you, myself, and then this framework, 3 different ways of using that wave analogy.
Yeah, and what I love about it then, of course, is it's taking my more feel and intuitive and experience of being in the wave, so to speak, and obviously feeling it myself as a thrower of a baseball for a long time and teaching this for a long time and seeing the effect for 30 years on players teaching it this way. But what I love about those examples is it's sort of bringing the science, right? It's sort of bringing, I don't know if kinesiology is the right word, but it's sort of bringing in this chain of how the body does work most efficiently and most naturally in this way.
And it explains why some guys can look like they're trying so hard and throw 87, and other guys look like it's so effortless and it's 102. But then that guy the 102 mile an hour guy gets injured, something happens, and now he's throwing 92. And it's a function of timing. It's a function of how well they can sequence the energy through their body. Like we realized a long time ago that simply chasing a higher squat or a higher bench press, or making athletes better athletes, like extremely important. But at the end of the day, like the hardest throwing big leaguers are not the guys that are bench pressing 400 pounds or squatting 600 pounds. They're all strong. They're all good athletes. Don't get me wrong, but they tend to be the guys that can transmit the energy through their body the most efficiently. Jacob deGrom, Walker Buehler, like these are guys that maybe aren't necessarily the most physically imposing guys. They're great athletes, but the way that they transfer that rotational energy through their body is just so seamless, so fluid. And I've reposted some interviews that Rob Friedman has tweeted about Jacob deGrom, and they asked him, like, what did you work on all 2020, like all quarantine, like what were you doing to come back sitting 101? And he said, literally all I just tried to do was be as smooth as possible. I just want every throw, it was like, how smooth can I be? And that's like all he was focusing on. So I just think it's really cool to see these concepts kind of emerge independent of you, me, like everywhere you look. It's just ongoing evidence that smoothness and efficiency is the name of the game, not just for velocity, not just for overpowering hitters, not just for, we'll talk about vertical break here in a second, but also from a health standpoint. Just how well can you produce that velocity from your body and from efficiency versus from having to brute force that from active muscular contraction. That's something we talk about all the time. Like you can get a guy super strong, super powerful, and have him like muscle up 92 all from his arm, and he carries that for an inning and then he's just fatigued. Or you can have the guy that just cruises for 9 innings at 92 and feels like he could keep going. And it's just a difference of how well they use their lower half. And that ties back to this version of crow hopping.
And also I'll add one thing because I love all of it, which is when you look at a wave is free, right? A wave, there's no technique in the wave. And I'm not trying to say there's not a time and a place for some technique. I'm just saying, based on what you just said, it's kind of coming back to this idea of a wave. A wave is free, right? It is gathering. There's no recipe per se to it. There's no technical part to it. It's just gathering and it's releasing energy. We could take infrared pictures of it or whatever and break it down, and we're just going to see a lot of water.
Right.
That the end, it's just happening very, very naturally. So I love how this thing keeps coming back to the wave and freedom, and really obviously efficiency.
So when you take a guy like Max and you introduce him to the concept, or get him back to what he had been doing in the past, perhaps, do you find that they immediately kind of pick up good timing, good sequencing? Or will you see, maybe it's when you work with a younger kid, for example, you show them the leg lift crow hop, but they still are kind of having issues with it. They're doing what you're saying, but maybe they're tipping uphill or they can't quite get the footwork down. Like, are there any specific issues that you see with this technique that you have to kind of correct from a coaching standpoint when you first introduce an athlete to it?
I mean, just because I'd have to do a lot of research and data if I really like wanted to fine tune it, it'd be hard to say like X equals Y. I can only tell you that when I show this to someone who is shuffling or sliding and I get them off their backside, it's night and day for them. It's a visceral effect on their body. It's a visceral effect on the body doing the work and taking the load. There's a sense of getting out in front. I'll use a very basic term. They feel like they can get out in front so much better. We haven't talked about pulling down yet. We're talking about a lot of uphill throwing and freedom there. The other huge benefit to loading on the backside, besides the health, of course, is the ability to get the energy out in front and get downhill, especially when you don't have the slope of the mound to help you out and you're on flat ground. So now it becomes imperative to not have your arm hanging and get that arm out in front with the support of the body. So to say for sure, like, I can't really say like we've had somebody who've had this issue, we've told them to do this, and then we've monitored them and we've got data on it. I can only tell you it's a feel thing that these kids immediately, I mean, look, in our pro camp, we had guys on the mound for a good month before spring training. We also did a ton of yoga and standing poses with them too. So it's hard to say like, what role did the co-op have for sure. But I would say this, if I asked a player after I did this and we went to the mound, I would say that they would say there's a noticeable effect on them feeling more loaded, more on their backside, because they notice it already on the flat ground right away.
Right.
So,
Gotcha. Well, let's dive in and talk about pull downs then. I know that's something that you've been preaching for, probably since before I was born. So, I mean,
how old
I'd
are you,
love
Ben? We'll figure that out right now. How old are you?
I'm 30.
Yep.
That's going to be close. Yeah.
Yep. 90. So 30, probably at least 32 years.
Awesome. Well, I know for me,
-2.
-2. There you go. I know for me, everyone watching this has heard of pull downs, has probably done a pull down of some sort. But when you talk about pull downs, there's a different level of detail that you go into. Like, to you, a pull down isn't just taking a curl hop and throwing it hard to a target, right? Like, that's where most people kind of stop. Some people envision like a radar gun in there and falling forward on your face or tumbling forward. Some people envision throwing it different weighted balls, different ball weights, velocity training programs. Take me through your definition of pull downs, because you may be the first one to ever, I don't know if you coined the term, but one of the first to really talk about pull downs as it relates to arm health, velocity training, and long toss. So take me through some of what makes the pull downs that you preach different than, say, right now, the popular just indoor facility, running 100 feet, sprinting and throwing weighted balls into a radar gun. What's different about your form of pull downs?
Yeah, ironically, when people do running guns, they're probably as close to a real pull down per se as possible in an ironic way. They're obviously running and maybe losing the ground forces, so they're doing a different act. But I would say in 32 years of coaching, I have rarely seen someone pull down correctly on flat ground according to crow hopping the right way. And what I mean by that is people can still pull down and it looks good like a pull down. So I'm not going to say that when you go out to 300 feet and you make your way in and you're throwing the ball with a lot of that 300 feet and pulling down, I'm not going to say you're not pulling down, because to some degree, of course, you are. But I like the question because I want to go to the art of pulling down.
Right.
The true art of a pull down is absolutely this. I don't know if the word absolutely is the word I want to use, but let's just say our definition of a pull down is this. We'll use 300 feet, of course, as a very simple analogy. If your max distance throw that day is 300 feet, and we can get into this later, not every day is a pull down day, of course, but your max distance throw is 300 feet. and you're like, you know what, I'm fully stretched out, I'm ready to come in. We bring our players in about 10 feet of throw on the way in. So it's like 23 throws to get to 70 feet. I wouldn't say 60 feet, because if guys throwing hard enough, it can get dangerous unless you gear up a catcher with a face mask. But so it's really only like 23 throws from 300 to 70 feet. And theoretically, you don't have to pull down with full gorge, you know, from 300 even 200. But what we want guys to do is, once they start getting from about 180, and again, they're using a very aggressive curl up at this point, a lot of support from their body. We want them to be able to say, after they make a throw, that throw would have gone 300 feet. So here's another way of saying it. 300 feet equals X. Okay, that's your max distance throw. Can you maintain X as you move in closer to your partner? Now, a lot of players can throw it 260 of their 300 feet at, let's say, 100 feet, and it's got hair on it and it looks good. It's not a true pull down. A true pull down is maintaining X, your furthest throw, all the way back into your throwing partner. And the reason why very few people can do it is because right around 120, 150, especially 100 feet, is they realize if they don't decelerate a little bit, they're going to throw it over their partner's head, they're going to play chase, they're subconsciously, no one's really trained them this way, so they just sort of are getting it to their partner. So this is a different level to know to maintain X as you get closer. Unless you know this cue, you're going to tend to launch your partner, which is another reason why you'll decelerate. So with our guys, for instance, we tell them they have to miss low versus high. We tell them rather the ball bounce 50 feet in front of your partner at 100 feet than 1 inch over their head. So we really kind of get them prepped that way. And most players, when we still cue them, aren't able to do it because it's a tough thing to pull off unless you have some practice. And what happens eventually is players will get competitive, because I'll get a player, for instance, into 80 feet that was out to 300 feet. And I'm like, okay, I want to see all 300 feet in this throw. And they'll throw 280 of it, and it'll look good. It's got a lot of hair on it, but they decelerate a little bit. I'm going to say that ball would have gone 240. It wouldn't have gone 300 feet. It was good. I mean, it was a B plus.
Right.
And so eventually you get them competitive to where they realize they have to start aiming 6, 7, 8 feet in front of their partner's feet to pull it off. Maybe more, maybe 20 feet. But at some point, then there's a bingo. And I'm telling you, it's like a pitcher throwing a perfect game. There's a magic to it when they do it right. And they maintain X, let's say 300 feet. And by the way, of course, the closer you get to your partner, the harder this is to pull it off, which is great, because the closer you can get them to their partner to pull it off, the more in tune they have to be with their mechanics, the more mentally they have to be relaxed to transfer 300 feet and get that release point out in front so low that the ball ends up. By the way, with our guys, we want the ball waist high or lower. And then once they get within 90 feet, we want it, well, maybe more like 70 feet, we want it knee high or lower. So in our pro camp, for instance, we had guys at 350 or more. If you see a 350-foot throw, compressed, Brent Strom term I got, if you see a 350-foot throw compressed into 70 feet, or we did in the Dominican with the Rangers, we got them to 60 feet, but we had catchers geared up with face masks. And it takes a while for them to get it, but when they get it, and they take their full 350-foot throw, and they maintain X, and they're able to compress that into 60 feet and have the ball end up at shin high or lower, you are talking about the optimal throw of angle uphill with layback into angle downhill, transferring all that energy, not beating yourself to the punch where your arm or release point is going to drag. So you got to figure out, how do I get 350 at 40 degrees uphill out in front so I don't beat myself to the punch and have the ball end up at shin high or lower. So that was a lot to say, but I want people to understand that a true pull down is maintaining X all the way back into your throwing partner and not decelerating 1 foot of your max distance throw that day.
So how important do you feel like it is to have a throwing partner on pull downs? Because right now the default is most pitchers they don't really want to catch pull downs. They don't want to catch any sort of velocity like that. And so the default is just guys throw into a net. How important do you think it is to have that context of actually being forced to get that throw downhill to a partner versus releasing into a net 10 feet away, even if there's a radar gun and the intensity part is there. Because I'm going to assume that the guy doing a pull down indoors into a net is still providing a true 100%. But how important is that downhill piece and actually having to do that to a partner?
I think it's very important to do it to a partner. As you know, for visual purposes, we're a big mental game people, and I think visuals are very, very powerful. However, I will say this. If you have a big arm and you are truly able to get out to 300 plus feet and you truly maintain your intent of your furthest throw, and you're missing shin high or lower, which means you are getting that downhill leverage and your ball is going to have a different type of explosiveness, trust me, or life or carry. And we'll get into that with spin efficiency in a second. It's just dangerous, to be honest with you. I mentioned even with the Rangers, these are professional catchers at 60 feet. I was still a little leery. I'd almost say I wouldn't want someone even with a geared up catcher in the face mask closer to 65 feet. I'd rather maybe them stay close to 70 feet. So to answer your question, yes, I think a visual is important. But at the end of the day, if you're with a coach or you really get this, or maybe you have metrics you can look at on a computer, but I'd say yes, in a perfect world, of course, you know, as you know, you definitely would want the visual. With that said, I still want someone to, this to me is Bruce Lee, 10th degree black belt. This is a different level. And I want, if a player can tell me that they were able to maintain the intent of their furthest throw, I'd want them into a net at 40 feet if possible, having the ball shin high or lower. The closer they get, the better the mechanics have to be, the better the fluidity has to be. I'll use the word we just used. The more relaxed you have to be, the more balanced you have to be. You have to figure out, I've used this analogy before for people to understand the effectiveness of a pull down is from just explosive point of view. Can you imagine if you and I were at 400 feet today, home plate to center field, and we were at 40 degrees. And I said to you, imagine that we're now at 30 feet with a net. And if you took a 400-foot throw that just went 40 degrees uphill, obviously we did this in progression, but you were able to have the ball end up at toe height on a net at 30 feet, and you maintain all 400 feet of that throw. What kind of mechanics would you need to have? Right. What kind of downhill plane would you need to get to? How relaxed in your mind and your body do you have to be? To me, this is like the perfect throw. So if someone can just get really good at this intent part, even on a net, I'll take it, because I want them to first understand this piece. And I'll say one last thing, and then I'll punt it back to you. This is why running guns serve a benefit, even though there's a part of running guns that I feel like, especially if they haven't long tossed properly and they're in an right. indoor facility and they haven't fully stretched out to 300 feet. That's my biggest concern about running guns indoors, or running guns too many days in a row because they're checking out their velocity. But the one thing, I don't want to say the one thing, because I don't know much about the science of running guns, but I would say that one thing I know I love about the running guns is they activate athleticism, and they do get guys the feel of what does it mean to maintain your furthest throw, even if they don't know that's why they're doing it. Right. But they do get the explosive training.
Right. Your tweak to those would be, hey, don't skip the actual extension phase, and do those running guns or those pull downs with the leg lift component. Outside of that, the idea of just absolutely letting it eat at some point in the off season or even in season, for the arm health velocity training standpoint, like you're fully on board with that side of it. You just don't want them to miss the finer details of what we're talking about in terms of how you coach the overall throwing program. It's not just about doing these pull downs in isolation.
In fact, I would add to that and say, yes, that's a great point. That I would say for our guys, what we would do, even if it maybe was even, I don't know if it was a bullpen day, but let's just say on a training day, I'd have our guys go out to 300 feet or so, do all the pull downs correctly, come in, be explosive. Our guys tend to be so healthy, they could do a lot of pull downs at the end, which was great for conditioning. But then maybe what I'd say is, instead of 10 or 15 heavy pull downs, let's do 5 or 8, take a little break, get loose again, and then let's do running gun for the purpose of that kind of blending, diversifying exercise for different reasons. But that would be like the last 1 or 2% of the workout of the day. And going back to something you said about these running guns indoors, that's what puts chills on the back of my spine when I see people doing that. Because I wonder, they're indoors, it's December, maybe in North Dakota, and I'm wondering to myself, did you, now some guys know to get into a net, go all the way uphill 300 feet, go all the way down. Great, you're ready. I just am really concerned about doing run and guns in situations where you are not fully stretched out. You didn't use everything we talked about at the beginning of this, as far as the loading, the core, the back leg, the ground forces. You didn't use that as a precursor to your aggressive throwing. And then, of course, just doing those run and guns too many days in a row.
So kind of building off of that, one of my questions for you was, we've talked about this kind of, at least in your system, the idealized version of how one should long toss, right? Build out to max distance on an arc, build in 10 feet at a time, downhill, ideally leg lift, curl hop. Do you feel like there are scenarios where maybe you have an athlete who you don't have them throw on an uphill angle? Maybe it's, hey, we're going to keep it on a soft line or on a line and build out to your max distance while keeping it more downhill, or maybe like a sidearm or a sinker ball guy or submarine guy, where maybe you know, a coach limits him to 120 feet or 60 feet or 90 feet. Do you think there are specific scenarios where kind of this gold standard version of your long toss can kind of be tailored, individualized?
First of all, yes, individualized in every scenario, as you well know, Ben. The arc thing to me is tricky, because if someone was having an issue with being up in the zone or whatever, I would still always want them to throw with arc uphill, because one of the staples in our program is we want range of motion and freedom and stretching before explosiveness. So even in the case of someone that, let's say, was having an issue with throwing the ball uphill, for health reasons, we still want them to open the arm up by gradually going uphill. Okay. Now, at that guy, as we've talked about, I would figure out other ways to figure out why they're not getting downhill well. But I wouldn't, just from us, I never want to say the word never, but I just don't like the idea of ever throwing the ball on a line from the get-go, because to me, you're keeping the arm in a very restrictive, robotic, sort of tight, tense area per se. And I want the freedom and the range of motion. That's how we've taught this forever. We just want freedom and range of motion before explosiveness. So to answer your first part of the question is, I just wouldn't want a player ever going out linear in almost any situation, unless they were doing that their whole life and they were healthy as could be, and they're 27 and they've got 4 years in the big leagues and they won the Cy Young Award. It's like, hey, what can I say? It works for you.
Right.
I still would want to have
more of an arm health and conditioning component to that, where you almost see that as building in a little bit of it's almost like a dynamic stretch for the arm with that intro.
Exactly.
So yeah. Okay. So it's not that an athlete couldn't theoretically like do a ton of mobility work and stretches and kind of compensate for not doing that. It's in your experience, it just always makes more sense just to take advantage of that component versus having to, you know, do a bunch of arm stretches and stretches for your upper back. Like, use the act of throwing uphill to groove that additional range of motion, get that extra 5-10% range of motion.
Yeah, it'd be like telling a run, exactly, Ben, really well put. It'd be like telling a runner who's having a problem running uphill or downhill to say, you know, I don't want you to stretch your hamstrings out first before you do this next action, right? I mean, that may not be the greatest analogy, but the point is that you still want to stretch the hamstrings out before you run, no matter what kind of training you're going to do in your running. You still want to start with A. A is I want stretching, range of motion, right? I want to position my body to be explosive in a safe, in a prepared way. And so so you said it well. Let's just get A done first, and we'll figure out how to get the guy down or gal down the hill if there's a problem there. Regarding the side armors and all that, I've had this question come up quite a bit. I actually threw sorta down under my first year in junior college, so I do have some experience. And what I did is I always long tossed traditionally, and I let all those benefits translate to down here. But I remember one guy in particular who was in the Cape at the time, and we had a great talk. I was out there in Chatham, and we just had a great talk in the bullpen. And he was, I'm just going to make it up, he was an 84, 85 guy, extremely effective. That's why he was in the Cape. And we were talking about long toss. And I said, look, you have two options, you know, because he would only went out to, I think, 120. And I said, hey, you have two options. I go, one, I would, you know, because I think he said he wanted more velo. He thought he wasn't going to get signed if he didn't throw harder. And so we started talking about long toss and velocity. And I said, well, you have two options. One is long toss traditionally and let that arm strength translate down there. I said, there's no question in my mind it's going to happen. I said, the other thing you might do, which I kind of like, is if you start long tossing from down there and you stay in your functional movements. And I said, maybe you're going to spin out a little bit more than normal. I go, but it's all variability. It's like there could be a lot of benefits to this. You're getting more torque. And so long story short is he got out to 300 feet and he was a submarine guy, not a sidearm guy, which I don't even know how, I mean, but he did. And I think he got up to 90, 91. He got signed. He ended up getting up to AA. But I've done this with other players to where it's, you know, I had Kirk Sarlis, I mentioned to you earlier, as a player in our camp. And he was kind of like you, kind of in here. And he threw 300 feet that way. And he'd start the ball, you know, 30 degrees to the left. And so he created that. And so I think it's really individual, as you already said. I kind of like the idea of staying within the area that you're working from and sort of spread out and open that area up. You know, you're going to get you're going to get variance not only in your arm and your arm path, but your body's going to move and maybe open up more. And maybe that's going to help the torque get better. Maybe just the length in the arm and the distance is going to help for explosiveness or velocity. But as you know, it's very individual. And someone like some of your pitchers may say, well, I don't want more spin efficiency. I want my ball to be a little funkier.
Yeah, so that's something that we talked about before recording. Is a couple of the athletes I've talked to, one of whom I work with directly. You know, these are guys who have top 5 sinkers in the big leagues right now, and it's just absurd, gross, you know, sharp vertical, late vertical movement. And so both of these guys have told me they never throw their sinker past about 60 to 75 feet, because what they find is that long toss, or the further they go out, the more efficient that spin is. But for a sinker, that actually flattens it out. For a four seam, it helps, and we can talk about this in a second, potentially helps that carry aspect because it's making that spin more efficient. But to your point, you're pointing out that they could actually potentially stay in their quote unquote natural arm slot and just let the ball sink. Let the ball sink. It's not going to go 300 feet. It's going to bounce at 75, 120, wherever it bounces because of that sink. I'm a guy who, again, lower slot, high kind of horizontal, high arm side run guy. But when I long toss, my body, it doesn't want to naturally stay in its slot. I end up climbing. And so I almost create like that different release point in long toss. And then I'm a little bit lower, like what you described for yourself. So your point would be, it is individual. Maybe it doesn't work for a guy like that, but to still potentially try staying in their true slot. And again, you might not get to 300 feet, but you can still reinforce and open up that movement within their natural slot and be able to see it over longer distances.
Yeah. Plus, what happens if the guy that has this great sink right now, top 5 in the league? Well, what if 3 years from now, his velocity, instead of it's 93, 94, is 90, 91, and he's losing a little bit of the sink because of it? You know, this could be a tool that he could use to get the velocity back up, which may or may not lead to more movement. It could.
Well, one of them actually said he would stretch it out with the four seam. So it was his way of like trying to apply these concepts for his movement, but with the specific grip, he only threw that to a catcher. But he was trying to keep the four seam, still feel like he could get his legs under him, still feel he got the extension out front. But then it was almost like he was not going to long toss with a curveball. He's not going to long toss with a slider. So he only long tossed with the efficient pitch, and then his inefficient pitches or his pitches that weren't the four seam, he only threw that to a catcher. So that, I mean, almost like that was his way of trying to come up with the best of both worlds.
And that could be brilliant. And it could be, again, we talked about macro, micro. Macro meaning, you know, he's taking all the benefits of the conditioning and the range of motion and the arm strength built from long toss. And then he's translating that back with one style. And then when he gets on the mound, he's staying in his movement patterns for his sinker. So he's getting that sort of turbo boost, maybe, right? Someone could argue that turbo boost could also, just throwing harder, he might lose a little movement because he's actually throwing harder, but maybe it's 2% less movement, but 3 more miles an hour. So that's a pretty
Right.
good
And maybe it's
trade-off.
sharper movement because it's a firmer pitch.
Well, that's another way of saying it. There's a guy, ironically, Ryan Sheriff, who's been out at UCLA, and I
Yeah,
think
he's been
he's
out here
got,
before as well.
okay, so you know Ryan. So Ryan might
Yep.
have, I think he said somewhere he's maybe in the top 3 of lateral movement between
Yeah,
his.
he's up over 20
So
inches.
he's out to 300 feet right now, long tossing, and he's through his slot like Sarlus I was explaining earlier. He's in that slot, and so and the coach he works with, they do a lot of stuff with Rapsodo and all that, and all the feedback. So it'll be interesting to see, because he definitely here's a good example. He wants more velocity. He doesn't want to necessarily lose movement, but as you just said, if you lose 2% of movement, but you gain, but you're 95 instead of 93,
Yeah,
be a
he would
game
probably take 18 inches of horizontal and sitting 96. I'm sure he would take that trade-off. We can ask him, but there's always a trade-off in almost any pitch metric that you're hunting. If you get that metric, something else is going to fluctuate correspondingly. So that's something we talk about all the time with our guys. We kind of linked to this concept. I know this is something we talked about originally last year, but again, we're talking about the idea of long toss pull downs influencing the efficiency of the spin. It's something very intuitive that, I mean, you've known it for years, but long toss tends to get that crisp backspin, at least if you train with that intent. If you specifically teach them to stay in a low slot and focus on that, obviously they're not trying to create that crisp backspin. But by and large, if you tell a guy to throw a ball further and stay loose, stay relaxed, and then pull down out front, you're going to be incentivizing and rewarding the throws that have this very efficient spin. So you asked me originally, what was my thought about kind of the link between high vertical break and carry, quote unquote carry, and long toss and pull downs. And so it's something that, we don't have any hard data on yet, but we've begun to kind of examine this link. And the way that I'll explain it to some of my guys is the same throw that carries 300 feet, right? Obviously velocity is a component to it, but the efficient spin is a factor in how well that ball actually carries at 300 feet. It's also a factor in how well that head high throw stays up and stays off the ground at 120 feet. Is the exact same factor that influences that ball that has a perceived or real induced vertical break at 60 feet. So when you tell that to a guy, it clicks in their head and they're like, oh, that 360-foot throw, that 120-foot seed, and that 60-foot Craig Kimbrell fastball that seems to rise, like those all have something in common. And so that's something that, obviously you can add your 2 cents here, but we've been playing with that concept of how do we train vertical break? Everyone wants to know how to train vertical break. And so you see a lot of guys like cheating the arm up to try to get their hand here for the pitch tracking technology. But your point was like, hey, I really think that pull downs might actually be this solution that's just staring us in the face this whole time of how to create that efficient spin, get out in front. So we've seen some good anecdotal results so far in just training the pull downs specific to their leg lift, getting on the mound and trying to replicate that exact same feeling out in front. And the cool thing is we've seen a couple guys go from high horizontal break guys, like 12 inches vertical, like 18 horizontal, to being able to do that in a bullpen at 18 to 20 inches of vertical. And their extension jumped up 6 inches. So staying on the pitch longer, getting out in front, and then there seemed to be a correlation between the extension getting up, just staying on the pitch longer, and the vertical number jumping up too. So what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously we're still in this kind of early phase where no one's done a study. No one's like shown this over n equals 1,000 pitchers, but it seems to make sense when you have these conversations. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, there's 2 things I'm glad that came up today. One was crow hopping, and one is this. Because, we've talked about this before. 5 years ago, I was at an ABCA, and I met Brian Conger for the first time, who's the pitching coordinator for the Reds, as you know, and we just started talking about a lot of things about long toss and this and that. And this was right around the time, maybe it was more, maybe it was 6 years ago, but it was right around the time that spin rate, people started talking about metrics, right? I'm not saying they weren't talked about before that, but this is sort of felt like the genesis of it coming on. And so I didn't know anything about it then. I really don't know a lot about it now. I mean, I picked up a few things here and there. I said to Brian, clear as day, I said, Brian, I can basically guarantee you that whatever this spin rate is, or maybe now it's spin efficiency or what you've called vertical break, but I said, you can teach this, you can improve it through long toss, and here's why. Every player I can ever remember working with that has learned to throw the ball with arc uphill and then pull down. And a lot of times they're in our camps for 2 months or 6 weeks or 4 weeks. So we're around them a lot. And the before and the after is just, it's borderline mystical. The one thing they all get, whether they throw 95 or 65, it's all relative. You can see this life in this carry. When I played before all of this stuff, the way a scout would call it, or a coach would call it, or even a player would call it, we would call it carry or life. Maybe life from a pitcher on the ball, maybe carry from an outfielder throwing the ball home. But for us, that was a big, like, in a weird way, it was like if you had carry or life on the ball, it was unique. It was different. If you had a pitcher that had that explosive life on the ball, it was different. And yet I felt like from the players we were training, I'm not saying everyone went from no life to like life off the charts, but the one common theme you could sense was that the ball started having this life of its own, just start having this carry. Now with the older guys that we knew, like especially our pro guys, if we knew they threw 90 or 92 and we saw what their ball looked like pre-long toss, I mean, it was a treat to see them getting out to 250, 300, 350, and you start seeing the pull downs. And this was basically across the board. This ball was absolutely jumping. So I said back to Brian, I said, Brian, if you've got guys that are only out to 150 or 180, at this might have been right before he got into pro ball. I said, trust me, if you get them to start throwing with more arc and further distance, you're just going to improve spin rate, or whatever the term would be nowadays. But the spin and the carry and the proper getting behind the ball is going to be noticeable. And then I talked to, so what I did is once we had that conversation, as this topic got bigger and bigger, I felt a need to talk about this more and more. So I called Randy Sullivan, who's someone I always lean on with more science stuff, and he loved this idea. He actually added a piece that I didn't think about. So I talked about the higher you throw the ball, the more range of motion, the more your body has to contort or torque, backward, the more layback in the hand and the wrist. And then Randy said, yeah, don't forget about the fingers. Even the fingers are going to lay back more, because to me, anything that goes backward more is going to go forward more. So I then called some of my good buddies, Nate Yeske, Scott Brown, Matt Hobbs, and I just started asking guys that I thought really were really smart. And I said, what does it sound like to you? And they all said the same thing. It's like, I said, I called you for the same reason, because I consider you very, very smart. And everybody said the same thing to me. Everybody. They said, it absolutely makes a ton of sense. There's no data, as you said. But for me, I think that will be the next big thing from just teaching pitching from the point of view, or just arm strength in general. Because look, if you take someone that's already out to 350 with 40 degrees and really knows how to pull down well, are they going to increase their spin rate by anything we're talking about? Maybe not. But I'm looking at this more from the population that's only going out to 120 or 180 or 200 or 210, or throwing with modified arc for whatever reason. Maybe they want to mechanically not come out of their mechanics, which is sort of an old school thing. But Ben, my goodness, like, I cannot wait. And I was kicking at you for
right.
6 months ago about it, and I know that you ate this stuff up. And
right.
But there's no question that I won't name the organization, but one of the pitching coordinators or pitching coaches did it with one of their lower spin efficiency or spin rate guys. And he might have been a guy that was on the bubble, maybe like an extended spring guy. And I believe he went from one of their lower end guys to either their top end guy or one of their top end guys just in the course of, I don't know, a month. So to me, it's a black and white topic. Yes, I don't have the data. It's anecdotal at this point based on 32 years of visual watching, observing, feeling myself. It's a massive correlation and it's there for the taking. And so anybody that's listening to this, whether you're in a pro organization or a college or a high school coach or a private coach, if you've got players that are not getting much arc on the ball on the way out, that to me is still the key. It's the range of motion up. And then, as you know, yes, it's getting behind the ball and pulling down correctly, which I'm glad we talked about that earlier.
For sure. And to go back to what you said back in the day, you just called it carry, or that pitcher had some hop on the ball, or the outfielder just had kind of had some life on its throws. Again, it's anecdotal, but I think it makes sense. We know that long toss and pull downs have an impact on velocity. That's one component to that ball staying up on a line. Spin efficiency, we already talked about that. The higher the spin efficiency, typically the higher the vertical break that you're going to see in most cases. And then extension is the other big one. The whole point of the pull downs being important there is to get that extension out front. And again, we've seen in the one pitcher that I've played with this with, he had that 6-inch jump in extension, which corresponded to the roughly 5 or 6 inch bump in vertical break from one bullpen to the next. And we know long toss is training all three of those things: spin efficiency, extension, and velocity. So to me, it makes sense. I mean, obviously I've talked to you, we're trying to figure out a way to reliably test this with enough pitchers in-house. But I agree, several years from now, it's going to be crazy looking back on it with how obvious this should have been to everybody, that we already have long toss and pull downs, which has been around now. You've been talking about this for 20 plus years. Now we can finally measure all of these pitch metrics. And it's like, it's taken 5 years for people to put 2 and 2 together, that these things actually really seem to connect.
Yeah. And I think the reason why it may have not come faster is I've just always done, along with my partner, we've done everything on feel and what we've experienced ourselves, and then feedback. I'm a feedback hound. I will ask questions nonstop to people about the littlest things. So I'm constantly getting feedback. If I bring up long toss to, Jerry Weinstein or Nate Yeske, to me, it's like, hey, how's it going out there? So for 32 years, you can say that it's not just what we're doing. It's having conversations with friends of mine out there that are coaches that I have so much respect for, that are doing things. Feedback you're giving me, Ben, it's like, I hear the same thing over and over and over. And that's why when I call these guys, I hate to say I know the answer, because I've lived it and I've seen it for so long and it's repeatable, but I just want to hear them in case they have a contrarian, voice. And they know me well enough. If they do, they're going to say it. And they're all right away like, absolutely. I mean, the more laid back, the more arc, and if you're able to transfer that forward. And also the other thing I love about this, Ben, is it's intuitive. I said something to you offline earlier or off camera about nature always wins. I mean, we talked about a wave to begin with. What a great way to kind of summarize. Nature always wins. The wave is going to win. The power, the natural power. Our bodies, the way it moves innately, naturally, it is so smart. It's so intuitive. So what we're talking about is really what nature wants to do with the body. Well, the body wants to stretch and be free and be in a relaxation mode. Then it's ready for the explosion mode, right? The more high intent mode. Well, this makes sense. If we want to improve spin rate and we get more layback and more freedom, and we can take that freedom into explosiveness forward, and we're taking 40 degrees instead of 10 degrees uphill and getting that range of motion, and then we're getting that downhill benefit because of the backward movement. It feels right. That's why I think when you bring this up to people, even if they're like, well, I haven't done data on it, I haven't really, but you're like, but man, that's the response I've gotten from everybody so far. Everybody I've brought this up to said the same thing. It makes a lot of sense and it feels right. And by the way, some of these guys I've brought it up to have done it themselves and felt it, or they've seen it with players.
For sure. And hopefully next time we hop on here for another podcast, we can have some hard data to dive into and look a little bit further in. But always a pleasure to talk to you, Alan. Super excited to be able to dive into some of these concepts. Hopefully people get a lot out of this conversation. I know I would love to hear, what questions people have for us. They can shoot us an email or drop that down in the comments below. But yeah, I'm looking forward to already doing this again in the future, and we can dive into some more topics. I'm sure you're going to want to talk about meditation component. That's something that we've been talking about more and more is the mental side, and how do we add visualization? How do we add routines? How do we add these other components, especially right now, kind of in this preseason, early season mode where a lot of pitchers are kind of unprepared, frankly, from a mental standpoint. So I'd love to start getting into some of those other topics, but I think we've rambled on for long enough. So any kind of final words to close this out?
Number one, thank you, man, because I've leaned on you for a lot, and I really respect and appreciate not only your insight, but your just openness to wanting to grow and evolve. And I've learned a lot from you, and doing this together to me was a big deal because of your background. And I think sort of counterbalancing sort of the feel with, even though you have great feel, but also with sort of the science. And so thank you for doing this. I've really enjoyed this, and I feel like together doing this, it's hopefully we've really given people some stuff to think about and apply. And I like what you said there at the end, someone that's made it through the end here. If you have any questions about any of this, comments, you don't like something you heard and you want to debate it, I mean, absolutely, please reach out to us. But no, the only thing I want to say is thank you for doing this, and hopefully really helping improve the game, which really means we're helping people improve their lives.
Awesome. Thanks again, Alan.
Yeah, appreciate it, buddy. We'll be in touch.